everyone, it's Lennon and welcome to the channel. Today I'm doing another VR to the wonderful Natalia over at Ouroboros. We can all trust that she will come up with some tags for us to respond to, and I think that she has such a gift that she can put forth topics that get all of us thinking and demand communication about it. I believe that that's such a gift that she possesses, and I love that about her. And this topic is no different. Spiritual addiction, mental masturbation. These tags filled me with such a note-taking vibe. It's not even funny. I started out taking notes on her channel, and then I watched a couple of VRs. I watched Mary Grace's video, which was fantastic. She talked about filling the hole. And I want to touch on a couple of points from Natalia's video in this. And I think that upon my note-taking, I started noticing that my thoughts in these topics were going towards more of a spiritual hedonism, this quest for pleasure in our spiritual practice. And whoever you are, or whatever your spiritual path is, I feel like as humans, we get stuck in ruts and stuck on the hamster wheel of buying things and becoming addicted to certain things, not just things, but maybe even mindsets. And I think that we have to differentiate between whether or not we're in this cycle and it's benefiting us or whether we're stroking the ego. I love talking about spirituality as like an umbrella term on my channel. I think that I like talking and touching on points because I feel like regardless of what spiritual path we are all on, I think that we're all on a journey, all on a quest, and it takes its toll. It can take its toll on us as humans, and I think it's important to note that as well. That I feel like there's points in our lives where we come back to spirituality if we've left it at all, and when we put forth, one foot in front of the other on our spiritual path, we have to constantly be thinking about what's really benefiting us. And I think that's a really important topic. But anyway, back to the point at hand here. Let me give you a little background. She did touch on collecting. She touched on ephemera, like tools and ephemera. And I feel like with all of that being in our face, like, you go to Etsy for something specific, and coming from someone who knows, you go to Etsy for something specific, you can get stuck in the rabbit holes of like the shopping network there. And it's real easy to do, especially like I said, Etsy, Amazon, stuff's on Instagram, and you're like, ooh, stuff's a lot more in our face than it was back in the ancient times. So I think it's easier for us to get trapped than it was for others. And I've got some coffee today, so cheers. And I wanted to touch on collecting. I don't collect a lot of spiritual ephemera. I collect a lot of things, but not for spirituality. I make a lot of my own tools, and I don't purchase a lot of decks. I only purchase decks that I will absolutely use. And so I feel like maybe, just to give a little background, I don't feel like I'm addicted to purchasing certain things for spirituality, but there is one thing that I am addicted to, and it's books. I have about probably more than 1,000 books in my possession. Some are in storage. I mean, there's just no room in my tiny space for all the books that I possess, but I'm constantly buying books. I want to make a whole separate video on this, but the last month I've been purchasing way more books than I probably am going to, I can't read them all at once, so that becomes an addiction as well. When I chase rabbit holes on my spiritual path and I'm taking notes or whatever, and then I read something that says, oh, this is a good reference for this, or this is a good reference for that, I'm like, yeah, it is. So that's a hamster wheel that I get stuck in. It's like the knowledge aspect of things, like books, and like I'm ever gonna have time to read all of them. I feel like when I was watching Mary Grace's video and she talked about filling the hole in spirituality, I wanted to touch on that too, because I feel like as humans, it's natural for us to want to fill the hole. I think that that's why the tree of life is such a powerful symbol, because and there's sephirotes, right? There's circles up the tree of life or down the tree of life, however you want to say it. And when we are on a quest for Keter, okay, the light, whatever divine is for us, whatever that looks like for us, we're filling the holes up the ladder, so to speak. And I feel like that is a perfect analogy to put forth here is filling the hole, filling the void. I know Natalia talked about, is this just a form of egoism? I think that partly our ego doesn't want to be uncomfortable. It doesn't want to go down paths that's going to demand sacrifice. It's not going to do that. And I think that we get stuck in wanting to stroke the ego and wanting to stroke the anarchy of the ego. And we have to watch out for that too, because it's selfish and it's going to, there's a level in the ego that is benefiting you. But then once you yourself get stuck in the cycle, you have to come back to self and know that you're in a cycle, and you have to know when to step back. And I think that it's kind of like the analogy I'll use here is like working out. When you're on a treadmill, right? Say you have reps, or you have say you have a time limit, like 30 minutes, or even miles, like you have 4 miles to go today. And so there's a stopping point in mind, right? And you're on the treadmill, your legs are burning like hell, but then you know yourself as well. You know that if you were to start hyperventilating, you know that you have to, put the treadmill back to walking or even get off, So there's a double side to that. Now I want to touch on suffering and sacrifice for a minute. I feel like, kind of like the story of Jesus, there's a sacrifice there. And I think that it's symbolizing and representing the suffering that humans must go through. And I think that when we get stuck on the hamster wheel of the ego and the anarchy of it, then it doesn't want to become uncomfortable with a sacrifice or a suffering. It doesn't want to suffer. And I feel like it's important to note that, just like being on the treadmill. You have to know the ego and know when it's benefiting you, but then you also have to know when it's completely not allowing you to suffer through certain things. And I think that the most powerful thing we can do is be on a quest, but then also know that the obstacles on our path are just as holy as the path itself. I think that that's highly important. Also, I want to touch on, again, like humans, we go through suffering and sacrifice, but then there's also the quest for the light, whatever the divine is, whatever the end of the cycle of our life is. It's all on immortality. We're wanting this sense that we're on this quest, that we feel like we're going to gain immortality at the end of our lives, because we're fearing so much of the unknown at the end of that cycle. And I believe that we get stuck in the gerbil wheel, or the hamster wheel, or whatever you want to call it, because we are fearing the end of a cycle, end of all things. And when certain things end, even if it's not a life, even if it's a mindset or an idea or whatever, I seem to touch on this a lot, is like the death of things. But I think it's highly important to note that when, like in terms of religion and spirituality in general, humans, instead of trying to go through life and actually live and have lots of different paths that we take, lots of different obstacles that we have to work through as humans, it turns somehow into a quest for immortality, where we won't have to deal with the suffering or the sacrifice at the end. And I feel like spirituality as a path, as a journey, needs to be about going through human life and human sacrifices and suffering, so that we can familiarize ourselves with death and familiarize ourselves with endings, and being and adapting to that and evolving towards that. And I think that is something to note. So anyway, I want to read this because I was going down rabbit holes and I read this and I thought, oh, we're going to use this. A selfish opinion hides in a hypothesis. Gaining an army of supporters, authority turns into a theory and then into a pseudo-fact. We're going to use this, okay? So say there's a tool or a deck or whatever, and we are going to automatically hypothesize. We're going to say, that's going to help us. That's our hypothesis, right? Such and such is going to help us. This thing over here is going to help us. And then it gains an army of supporters, which means basically we're going to be justifying why that's going to help us. And we start, putting forth ideas on how we're going to use that and how we're going to do this, how we're going to do that. And that becomes justification, which becomes supporters of our hypothesis, right? And then it says, the authority turns into a theory. The authority being you, the anarchy of the ego here. And we have to watch out for, is it the ego that we're stroking here? or is it actually going to benefit us? And then it turns, like I said, this anarchy turns into a theory. We're theorizing that it's going to work, and then it turns into a fact. Without even an experimentation, we've already made it a fact in our brain that such and such is going to help us or heal us or whatever. And that is yet another gerbil wheel that we go down, is that we tend to hypothesize certain things in our journeys. When we're stuck on the cycle of hypothesis, gain the army of supporters, justify that purchase, justify why you hit the buy now button, and then turn your, you stroke the ego, and then it becomes a theory, and then it becomes a pseudo fact. What happens at the end of that cycle? Disappointment. Yeah. So say you get this tool, right? And you've hypothesized, you've wrote the whole first paragraph into this scientific method, okay, on why this such and such is going to help you, okay? When we get stuck in that mindset. And then what happens is once it's in our possession, or once we've used it a couple of times, we let it sit in the bottom of our closet like a broken toy. Tell me how I know. Tell me how I know that there's not a closet full of toys in my children's closets that they don't use anymore. They really, really wanted them at the time, right? They really, really wanted it. They thought that this was going to help me do this. This was going to do this. This was going to curb my boredom. So what happens when it turns into a disappointment? What happens? That pseudo fact has turned into a delusion. You start going back to the cycle again. Going back to you it's an afterthought. You no longer think about it. Once that pseudo fact has turned into a delusion, you let it go. You completely let it go. You don't go back and try the experiment again. Now, I want to touch on mental masturbation, because when she said this, I was like, oh my God, Natalia, you naughty thing. But it immediately got me thinking of lust versus love. And I know that mental masturbation is kind of touching on ego here, not lust or love, but it got me thinking that. And how when we have a spiritual practice that we love, or that we think we love, are we in the cycle of love, which is an unconditional circle, or are we stuck in the throes of lust? And I think that it's important to know that as well. Just like in a relationship, you have to know whether you really love that person or if it's just your lust talking. I think that especially when we start dating people, like I guess at, whatever age you start dating, then it's really hard to know the difference. And I think that part of that journey with finding a partner is just as hard, and just as about going through the suffering and sacrifice of those aspects as well. It got me back on the topic of spiritual hedonism. Are we chasing the O? Okay, because what is an O? I know it stands for orgasm, but it's an O, right? It's a circle. But what do we chase when we're chasing lust? A peak, not a circle. What if lust for these things is symbolized by a peak in our brain? When we're stuck on that gerbil wheel of that hypothesis turning into a pseudo fact, right? What if the hypothesis and everything, it turns into a pseudo fact up here? We've gotten the O, but then what happens is that dies down, and that's where the disappointment and delusion happen. So it's like we're stuck chasing the high of the peak, not the circle. And how when we're in a spiritual practice, or on a journey, and we should be chasing love as a deep-seated need, as a deep sense of wholeness and completeness, that is just like her sacred symbol, the Ouroboros. It's about cycle after cycle after cycle, and it's not ending. And this fear that we have about endings, this fear that we have of the unknown, right? Of going back into that serpent mouth. We fear the darkness when we have no idea that we go into the darkness to yet again become the serpent again. Start all the way over. And most of us get stuck not wanting to do that. I think that being on a spiritual path is about waking to the fact of death and waking to the fact of sacrifice and suffering being the part of the path and acknowledging that. And I think that the point of spirituality is to go through many deaths and many disappointments and many delusions. And I think that it is about, I do think that spirituality, at least for me, is about knowing the difference between stroking the ego and healing the self. Spiritual love to me is where immortality lies. Spirituality, being on a journey and constantly dying, constantly ending cycles to keep growing. I feel like it's imperative for us to keep growing, but we can't if we're not shedding those things, if we're not literally shedding the things that aren't serving us. If we're too scared to shed them because the ego is an anarchist, then we're not going to grow and we're not going to go up the tree of life. And I think that, like I said, I think that's why that's a perfect symbol. And I think that immortality lies in the circle of spirituality, not the peak. And that's why when I heard mental masturbation, I thought, ooh, stroking the ego or chasing the peak of lust. And then it got me thinking of the circle and the Ouroboros of spirituality and what that means to all of us, and how if we're not open to suffering and sacrifice, then we're not going to grow and we're not going to gain enlightenment, if that's the term you want to use. Now, I know that she touched on the fragility of our ego, the vulnerability that we must face to not keep our ego, to stop stroking the ego. There's a fragility there and there's a vulnerability there. The fragility of our ego has manipulated us into thinking that spiritual love stops at death, that our spiritual path stops at death. But I don't believe that spiritual death is the opposite of living. What we put into our spiritual practice and what we put into the things that we use, even if we are stuck in an addiction, the raw primal energy that we put forth into our spiritual practice is where the immortality lies as well. Like she said, I feel like when she said bow to, get on your knees for the sun and the moon, I feel like as a pagan, I use nature as as a symbol for humanity. The universe and nature and earth, it goes through cycles, right? And you think the raw primal force of the sun, it has the power to give life and take it away. And I think that in terms of spirituality, or even just being a human, it's important to note the power of the universe because it's going through cycles as well. And I think that when we get down on our knees and there's a level of worship there in spirituality, and there's a level of bowing. You're not bowing to anything but the cycles. Why not do that for self? So, okay, anyway, I'm going to continue to keep stalking this because this topic got me thinking on things that I may be addicted to, even if it's like books and knowledge and information, because I'm an information geek. There are still levels of we have to put forth things, we still must do, and we still must die a little, and we still must give way to new concepts. And I think that that's what's so powerful about YouTube as well, is this sense of communication and dialogue that all different creators put forth, that it takes away the anarchy of the ego as well, gaining new perspectives from people, getting, like, you put forth an idea and then someone counteracts, counters your opinion with one of theirs. And it's about the dialogue, but that seems to keep the ego at bay as well. That they're not going to say their opinion to stroke your ego. So it's about learning how to have the dialogue with other people that is helping you to have the dialogue with your own self. And I think that's why it's important to, keep the dialogue going with self and with others, because you're both are going to teach you something. I hope you enjoyed this. I will leave links to Mary Grace's video because I mentioned it, and of course Natalia's original video to this below. Please check them out, and I hope to see everyone again back on my channel to talk more about spirituality, because you know I'm going to. Much love.